this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're in session number 2 of our new series entitled QME Update 2023. And I have a fascinating discussion for you today, one of which I'm sure is going to benefit you immediately as you start to understand the prevalence of this concept that I want to share with you in today's discussion in your QME evaluations. And before we get into the topics of today's discussion, let's just briefly review where we've come from so far in this program and where we're headed in our remaining sessions in this program. In session number 1, which was completed last week, we talked about causation, AOE, COE, South Coast framing, and you as the qualified medical evaluator. And we'll summarize that program in just a moment. But recall, if you were with us on last week's discussion, we learned, probably newly with new eyes and new ears, that the threshold for industrial causation in the state of California is extremely low. Well, the South Coast framing case established the new lowest threshold for industrial injury, and we'll summarize that program in just a moment because it contains very important concepts for us in moving forward as qualified medical evaluators. In today's session, I want to talk to you about the presumptive injuries under Labor Codes 3212 and 3213. This is a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately for myself, this is something I'm only learning very, very late in my career as a qualified medical evaluator. So if you're anything like me, these ideas and these injuries and these particular sections of California workers' compensation law may be new to you, and I'm very, very excited to share those with you. And today, as we talk about the presumptive injuries, we're going to focus our attention down to a specific subset of the presumptive injuries, and that has to do with lower back injuries in those employees, certain classes of employees, who are required to wear a duty belt as part of their employment. This is the so-called duty belt presumption. So we'll talk about that in today's session. In our next session, and you're going to see that these sessions all tie together very nicely. They all have overlapping implication, one topic to the next topic in this series of discussions. In our next session, we're going to talk about the post-employment cumulative trauma injury claim. And even in today's discussion, the case that I want to share with you to illustrate the duty belt presumption injury involves a claim filed post-employment. So we're going to see some overlap and maybe even some introduction into next week's topic with today's topic. And this is going to be very, very important for you to understand because you're going to see dozens, hundreds, and thousands with no exaggeration. If you have an extended career as a qualified medical evaluator, you will literally see hundreds and thousands of claims filed for cumulative trauma injury when those claims are filed after the separation of the employee from the employer, the so-called post-employment cumulative trauma injury claim. In session number 4, we're going to talk about common report violations and how you can immediately improve the content and quality of your report such that your report accomplishes several objectives. Number 1, and most importantly, such that your report can quickly and accurately resolve disputed issues in the California workers' compensation system so that your report can reduce delay and can reduce unnecessary costs and burden on the system, and so that your report can remain out of the scrutiny of the disciplinary committees being formulated now between a liaison between the workers' compensation judges and the Division of Workers' Compensation. So this is going to be a very important session for you that will immediately, if you implement only one suggestion from what I have to share with you in this particular session, your reports will immediately be infinitely better than they currently are. Session number 5, we're going to talk for a whole hour about depositions, and I want to share with you some brand new ideas, some brand new revelations, some brand new insights about depositions that will help you tremendously even in your very next deposition. And I'm not going to say a lot about it now, but I just want to tell you that what I will have to share with you in session 5 about depositions will completely change your perspective on depositions. Even if you already are very comfortable with depositions, even if you already enjoy depositions, I'm going to share with you some insider secrets that can only be learned the hard way through the School of Hard Knocks that will help you enjoy and profit greatly from the number of depositions that are certain to come your way over the length of your career as a qualified medical evaluator. Finally, in session number 6, I want to talk with you about the various timelines, the multitudinous timelines that are operative in each and every QME evaluation. And I want to share with you some ideas as to how you, as a qualified medical evaluator, can easily adhere to your timelines, meaning the timelines that govern all of the sequences and cycles of action that are initiated in your office from the inception of the first phone call all the way to putting the final period and your signature and getting that report out one way or another in the mail, through the email, getting it billed and getting it paid. I want to share with you how you can reduce the timelines and comply with all of these timelines. So this is what we're looking forward to in this program, QME Update 2023. And let's just quickly summarize before we get into session 2, today's discussion. Let's quickly summarize what we learned in session number 1, entitled Causation, South Coast Framing, and the QME. Now, in session 1 of this program, entitled Causation, South Coast Framing, and the QME, we learn that the threshold for industrial injury in the state of California is very, very low. And the reason it's very, very low is because a low threshold helps to comply with the philosophy of the liberal construction philosophy itself in California workers' compensation. And that is that in gray areas of dispute, the tie goes to the runner, meaning that all disputed issues that can be resolved should be resolved in favor of providing benefits to injured workers. This is the liberal construction philosophy. So we know that the threshold for industrial causation is very, very low. We hear this sometimes referred to as the 1% rule. And in the South Coast framing case, we learned that the threshold may even be lower than 1%. We learned that in the South Coast framing case that all that's required to establish industrial causation, AOE, COE, is that the employment be one of the contributing causes without which the injury would not have occurred. This is very, very important because we do not need to prove that the industrial injury was the sole cause or is one of a couple of causes. The industrial exposure need only be a contributing cause, need only be one of many contributing causes. And in the South Coast framing case, the qualified medical evaluator that opined that the industrial exposure, in this case it was exposure to medications that were prescribed to treat an industrial injury. So the industrial exposure was very, very minuscule, was very, very tiny, was equivalent to what the qualified medical evaluator analogized to 2 crumbs off of the crust of a 12-inch pie. But the qualified medical evaluator sealed the deal for industrial causation by stating that the industrial contribution was greater than zero. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on this as we go. So it's a very, very low threshold. Further, it's sufficient if the connection between work and the injury be a contributing cause of the injury, not the sole cause. So that's simply another restatement. Further, industrial injury need only be a contributing cause to the disability. The disability meaning the need for medical treatment and or the need for compensable time off work in the form of total temporary disability, or even temporary partial disability in the form of work restrictions. So the industrial injury need only be a contributing cause to an employee's need for medical treatment. It need only be a contributing cause to the employee's need for work restrictions. It need not be the sole cause. It can be a cause only as great as the equivalent of 2 crumbs off of the crust of a 12-inch pie. Now, this is an example, this lowering of the threshold for industrial injury, which we talked about the sequential steps in the language of the laws that describe industrial injury. This language, this sequential language, sequentially lowers the threshold. And this is consistent with the philosophy of liberal construction. So liberal construction is a philosophy that governs all workers' compensation laws in the state of California that provides for the protection of persons injured in the course of their employment in the form of benefits. Protection is offered in the form of benefits. So this lowering of the threshold for industrial injury lowers the threshold for which persons qualify to receive benefits under California workers' compensation. Now, as a segue from session number 1 into today's session, session number 2, we're going to see that for certain classes of employees, and we're going to talk about those in just a minute, for certain classes of employees, this philosophy of liberal construction becomes exponentially applied. Liberal construction becomes exponentially applied for certain classes of employees for certain conditions. And these conditions, these injury conditions, are referred to as the presumptive injuries. So with that as our introduction, and hopefully you're compelled to continue with the program based on that introduction, let's get into the topic of today's discussion, which are the presumptive injuries under Labor Code sections 3212 and section 3213. Okay, so let's begin today's discussion regarding the presumptive injuries. Now, before we get into the specific conditions that qualify as presumptive injuries, let's just establish a little bit of foundational philosophy for today's discussion. Remember in our last session that we talked about the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury here in the state of California. Remember, the general principle is that the person, the party, holding the affirmative of the issue has the burden of proving that particular issue. So in the case of an injured worker, employee, applicant, or examinee, as we call them as qualified medical evaluators, this party, this person, is forwarding the contention or the allegation of an industrial injury. So the burden for establishing and proving that industrial injury falls upon the injured worker. And this is what many times brings injured workers to us for a qualified medical evaluation, as the injured worker attempts to convince us that an industrial injury occurred, that the health condition that they're presenting to with us in the face-to-face evaluation can in some way be traced or linked in a causal fashion to the workplace duties. The applicant, the examinee, is attempting to carry their burden of proof by coming to us for a qualified medical evaluation. Now, fascinatingly, this burden of proof in the presumptive injury becomes relieved from the applicant. It becomes relieved from the employee. And the burden of proof is lifted from the applicant because the law presumes, these are called the presumptions, under the law, which is Labor Code section 3212 and 3213, the law presumes that for certain classes of employees, these certain classes of employees, when they have these certain conditions, the law presumes that those conditions are at least contributed to in some causal fashion by the workplace duties. So let's define this term presumption as it applies to today's material. So according to Webster's, a presumption is an idea that is taken to be true and is often used as the basis for other ideas. Although it is not known for certain, it's presumed to be true. these injuries, these certain injuries in these certain classes of employees are presumed to be industrial in nature. And this basic concept is taken to be true, that these conditions are industrial in nature. So there is no burden of proof on the applicant, but as we're going to see, and as we get into these two labor codes, as we're going to see, the burden of proof is actually a burden of disproof. The burden of disproving an industrial injury then falls upon the employer, because by law, the injury is presumed to be industrial. Unless proven otherwise, it's presumed to be industrial. So therefore, the burden of proof shifts to the employer to disprove the industrial nature of these injuries. Very, very fascinating. And it's an example of the exponential application of liberal construction. Can you see that? Can you see that this is liberal construction exponentially applied to benefit these certain classes of employees? These certain classes of employees include employees in the Department of Corrections, employees in the sheriff's departments, probation officers, police officers, and we get these classes of examinees all the time. Well, little do you know, little may you know, little did I know that many times these employees that are involved in face-to-face evaluation with me, little did I know that I was evaluating a presumptive injury. See, this is going to be important for you moving forward. If you can recognize and identify this principle operative in your next evaluation that involves a police officer, that involves a correction officer, you can know the direction of the case, you can know the proper resolution of the case, you can begin with the end of the case in mind, knowing these laws, and working backwards, step by step through your evaluation, such that you can quickly and accurately complete these evaluations properly and in accordance with the laws governing these presumptive injuries. So let's go through Labor Code sections 3212 and 3213, talk about some of these presumptive injuries, and then we're going to focus our attention down into the lower back injuries due to what is referred to as the duty belt presumption. So let's go through these labor codes and see what injuries are covered, what injuries are presumed to be presumptive under these particular labor codes. Now you're going to find these presumptive injuries in Labor Codes section primarily 3212, but also spilling over into the very next Labor Code 3213. And each of these particular subsections under Labor Code, under these labor codes, such as section 0.0, section 0.1, section 0.2, etc., largely deal with different groups of employees. They deal with similar conditions, similar injury conditions, but each of these particular labor code sections deal with different classes of employees. So for example, Labor Code section 3212.0 deals with hernia injuries, pneumonia injuries, and heart trouble injuries in certain classes of employees. Labor Code section 3212.1 deals with cancer and leukemia, cancer including leukemia cancer, in certain classes of employees, and these certain classes of employees are delineated in these particular sections of the Labor Code. 3212.2 deals with heart trouble problems in the Department of Corrections. Now, how many of you out there listening to today's discussion evaluate employees who work for the Department of Corrections? Employees who work for the Department of Corrections have a presumptive heart trouble injury presumption by law. Here is the law. The law is 3212.2. Now, what this means is that if you work for the Department of Corrections and you're having a healthcare visit, say with your primary care physician, for a bunion on your toe or for a sunburn or for a stomach upset or for any unrelated non-industrial condition, and your primary care physician, in taking your blood pressure, diagnoses you as having pre-high blood pressure or hypertension, etc., that hypertension, that high blood pressure is presumed, under this law, is presumed to be industrial in nature. So in this sense, for your high blood pressure, your workplace employer pays benefits for that high blood pressure. This is specific under this labor code for the Department of Corrections. It's specific for a different class of employees under this particular section of the labor code. Okay, so are you getting a flavor for the tremendous liberal construction and the tremendous benefit that this applies to some of these particular specific classes of employees, such as police officers and Department of Corrections? 3212.3 deals with heart trouble and pneumonia now in peace officers, and this may explain why you're seeing so many peace officers for evaluations, especially if you're a cardiologist. 3212.4 deals with University of California police officers and peace officers in the UC system. And then 3212.5 deals with the same conditions: heart troubles, pneumonia, and hernia conditions in the California Highway Patrols and other state highway patrol officers. So very, very interesting. You're starting to get a sense of the particular classes of employees that are covered under these two labor codes. And these two labor codes provide for workers' compensation benefits for conditions that, no matter their source, no matter their cause, by law, these conditions are presumed to be industrial until disproved by the employer. And I'll share with you the approaches that employers have available to them to attempt to disprove these injuries, which routinely fail to succeed because by law, unless the evidence is convincing, these injuries and these conditions are presumed to be industrial in nature. Okay, so let's continue through 3212 and into section 3213. Okay, now so continuing through Labor Code section 3212, 3212.6 deals with tuberculosis and other lung injury conditions. 3212.7 deals with Department of Justice employees for the same conditions: hernia, pneumonia, and heart trouble. 3212.8 deals with blood-borne infectious diseases. These blood-borne infectious diseases are presumed to be industrial for certain classes of employees. 3212.9 deals with meningitis injuries. 12.10 deals with tuberculosis injuries. And 3212.11 deals with skin cancer injuries in particular classes of employees, such as lifeguards. When a lifeguard qualifies for this particular injury under section 3212, the skin cancer condition is presumed to be industrial due to exposure on the job as a lifeguard. And there are a couple of other sections in Labor Code section 3212. You should be familiar with these injuries, and you should be familiar with these classes of employees, because especially these classes of employees constitute a bulk of the evaluations that we are called upon to evaluate as qualified medical evaluators. And now that you know that some of these injury conditions are presumed to be industrial in nature, it provides great insight and a lot of common sense as to the reason why we're being called upon to evaluate these injuries. Now, as we get into section 3213 now, 3213.2 deals with the lower back injury due to the duty belt presumption. And that's going to be our topic for today's discussion, the duty belt presumption. This is a presumption that for certain classes of employees, especially police officers, who are required to wear a duty belt as a part of their employment, when and if these employees develop lower back impairments, lower back injuries, those injuries are presumed to be caused by the workplace duties. Those injuries qualify as an industrial injuries regardless of the cause, unless the employer can disprove the industrial causation of these particular injuries and or impairments. So let's dive deep into the duty belt presumption, and this is going to be important for neuromusculoskeletal evaluators who encounter these types of evaluations all the time. Okay, so according to Labor Code Section 3213.2, Section C, it tells us the definition of a duty belt. So for purposes of this section, a duty belt means a belt used for the purpose of holding a gun, for holding handcuffs, for holding a baton, and for holding other items related to law enforcement. And you've all seen law enforcement officers wearing these different types of duty belts, all of which, once they're fully loaded, can be quite large, can be quite cumbersome. And these are worn around the waist of police officers throughout the course of their daily duties and in the course of their employment. And as you can see, this is a typical duty belt here. Once it's loaded with a pistol, once it's loaded with a baton, once it's loaded with handcuffs, once it's loaded with pepper spray, once it's loaded with other items such as keys and whatever else is required in the course of employment as a police officer, over time, this cumbersome duty belt can result in the onset of symptoms of lower back pain. And when that situation occurs, that lower back pain and that injury to the lumbar spine is presumed to be industrial due to wearing this duty belt. This is the so-called duty belt presumption. And here is another example of a duty belt. And I'm sure you've seen police officers with these large and cumbersome belts. And including in this case, this one includes a large radio communication device. Looks like a walkie-talkie of some sort with an antenna. Here's a holster holding a gun, various pockets and compartments for holding other law enforcement items as well. Here's a back view of a similar situated duty belt. Here's a pair of handcuffs here. Here are a pair of gloves dangling from the duty belt, various rings for holding keys and other objects. This particular radio communication device is tethered by a cord, which would further constrain the mobility of the duty belt. And you can see that wearing a duty belt over a period of time could reasonably result in the onset of symptoms of lower back pain, especially when this duty belt has to be worn whether the employee is standing, whether he's sitting, whether the employee is running. In other words, it's required that this duty belt be affixed or worn on the body throughout the daily shift of a police officer and in the course of police officer employment. And then finally, although it's not clearly elaborated in law as a duty belt is, a duty vest may also qualify under the duty belt presumption. And the case that I want to share with you today does discuss an officer who wore both a duty belt and a duty vest in the course of his employment and who qualified for industrial injury under the duty belt presumption. So just be aware that some police officers wear duty belts, some police officers wear duty vests, and this is an example of a duty vest. And you can see that once this duty vest is fully loaded with all these pockets and compartments, that it could be quite heavy on both the thoracic and the lumbar spine in the case of a duty vest, primarily on the lumbar spine in the case of a duty belt. And here's a duty vest in operation or in full action, and you can see the pockets loaded. There's a retaining belt here down across the bottom. And wearing this over a period of days, weeks, months, and years could certainly, within reasonable medical probability, contribute to lumbar and thoracic spine problems. And under at least the duty belt presumption, those lumbar spine injuries qualify as an industrial injury by law. So let's review the exact language of the duty belt presumption and how that presumption affects your opinion on AOE COE, how it affects your opinion on permanent impairment for these certain classes of employees, And finally, how the duty belt presumption impacts your apportionment, approximate percentages for these lumbar spine injuries. Okay, so let's read from Labor Code section 3212.13, and this is rather small print. I hope you can read it, but please follow along very closely because there's several nuances in the language of this law that are important for us as qualified medical evaluators to understand. So 3212.13.2 tells us that in the case of a member of a police department, so this deals with police officers, police department of a city, county, or a city and a county, or a member of the sheriff's office of a county, or a peace officer employed by the Department of the California Highway Patrol, or a peace officer employed by the University of California. So that's peace officers in the state of California are covered under this duty belt presumption. So that's number one qualifier to qualify for the duty belt presumption, is that you be an employee of one of these certain employers, okay? So if that's established, if you're one of those employees, and if you have been employed for at least 5 years as a peace officer on a regular, full-time salary, and you're required to wear a duty belt as a condition of employment, that's condition number 2, you're a full-time, full-salary police officer, peace officer, required to wear a duty belt. So there's 2 qualifiers. And you can see that these 2 qualifiers are areas where the employer could attempt to disprove the duty belt presumption by proving that you're not a full-time salaried employee or that you're not required to wear a duty belt as a part of your employment. But if those 2 criteria are met, then the term injury, as used in this division, includes lower back impairments, lumbar spine injuries that go on to become lumbar spine impairments. The compensation that is awarded for lower back impairments shall include full hospital, full surgical, full medical treatment, disability indemnity, meaning total temporary disability, permanent disability benefits, is presumed to be industrial, these lower back conditions, and therefore these peace officers qualify for disability indemnity and death benefits as provided by the provisions of this division. And this is an example of exponential application of liberal construction, especially for these certain classes of employees. Now think about it. Think about how many people in the population are going to or have developed lower back injury, lower back impairment. Lower back injuries are almost ubiquitous in the general population, but for these classes of employees, when they develop lower back pain, lower back injury, and lower back impairment, that pain, that injury, that impairment is compensable under California workers' compensation. And this is an exponential application to give consideration to the service that these particular classes of employees provide to all of us citizens throughout the state of California. They're covered under these presumptive injuries, and specifically under the duty belt presumption. Now, this lower back impairment, so developing or manifesting, and these are 2 verbs important for you to understand. The impairment developing or manifesting. And it's important for you to understand that the impairment can develop and manifest at the same time, or the developing of the impairment and the manifesting of the impairment can occur at different times. And this is another area where the employer can attack the allegation, the presumption that the back pain is industrial by proving that the impairment neither developed and neither manifested during the employment. Now, it's very, very interesting. In another application of liberal construction, these particular classes of employees are further protected by extending the time period during which the condition can manifest itself and during which the employee can report the injury once the condition becomes so manifest. So let's read from this section. It says, this back impairment, so developing or manifesting itself, shall be presumed to arise out of and occur in the course of employment. This presumption, of course, is disputable and may be controverted by other evidence, but unless it is so controverted, the appeals board is bound by law to find in accordance with it, to find industrial injury in accordance with this section of the law. Now, pay close attention here. It says, this presumption shall be extended to a person following termination of service. And this is how we transition into our next topic, the post-termination claim or the post-employment cumulative trauma injury claim. And can you see that the duty belt presumption is representative of a cumulative type of injury claim? So here we get our first introduction into the post-employment cumulative trauma injury claim. The presumption shall be extended to a person following termination of service for a period of 3 calendar months for each full year of the requisite service, which is 5 years of requisite service, but not to exceed 60 months in any circumstance. So the peace officer has up to 5 years, in the case of a greater than 20-year employee, 20-year police officer. The police officer has up to 5 years after the last date of employment to report industrial injuries. So this is a post-employment. This allows for the post-employment reporting of these presumptive injuries. So you can see why now we see so many peace officers, so many Department of Corrections, so many other police officers reporting these types of injuries post-employment, which these evaluations then come to us for our compensability determination, when in fact, when we're aware of this section of the law, the compensability determination is already established under this particular section of the law. So this is a third exponential application of the liberal construction philosophy. Now, in a final application of exponential liberal construction to these particular classes of employees, I want to talk to you about what Labor Code section 4663 has to say about these presumptive injuries in general, and specifically about the duty belt presumption. So I have here for you the full text of Labor Code section 4663, and I know that you're familiar with this, so we're not going to go over this in great detail. But I just want you to notice structurally, or as this particular Labor Code is laid out section by section, we have sections A, B, C, and D of this Labor Code. I'm going to share with you the next section, section E, in just a moment in the next slide, but just refresh our memories that section C says, a physician, in the case of a permanent impairment, that is, a physician shall make an apportionment determination by finding what approximate percentage of the permanent disability was caused by the direct result of injury arising out of and occurring in the course of employment, and what approximate percentage of the permanent disability was caused by other factors, both before and subsequent to the industrial injury, including prior industrial injuries. Now, this section of the law tells us what our obligation is as a qualified medical evaluator in those cases that deal with permanent impairments. So with the duty belt presumption, we're talking about permanent impairments to the lumbar spine. So imagine you have a police officer who you've evaluated, and you determine that there is a permanent impairment of the lumbar spine. Now, no matter how you rate that permanent impairment of the lumbar spine, whether you use one of the DRE categories, or whether you use the range of motion method, or regardless as to how you rate that permanent impairment, if that employee was other than a police officer covered under the duty belt presumption, you would then provide your apportionment approximate percentages as required by law under Labor Code section 4663, section C. But how is this handled in the case of peace officers covered under the duty belt presumption under Labor Code Section 3212, 13.2? Well, let's have a look at Section E of this Labor Code, Section 4663. So that was Labor Code Sections 4663A through D. Section E of Labor Code Section 4663 tells us that A, B, and C do not apply. Do not apply to injuries or illnesses covered under sections. And notice here, here's 3212 with all of its subsections. And here's 3213.2, the duty belt presumption. So for the presumptive injuries, when the presumptive injuries result in a permanent impairment, such as a lumbar spine impairment under the duty belt presumption, there shall be no apportionment of that disability to non-industrial factors. Isn't that amazing? This is a tremendous application of liberal construction in favor of providing benefits for these particular classes of employees. And here we're talking about police officers. No other employees enjoy this tremendous, tremendous unapportioned benefit, okay? These classes of employees can have lower back pain, lower back injury, lower back condition as a result of any cause, industrial or non-industrial, and the condition is presumed to be industrial under law. And any impairment resulting from that injury is presumed to be 100% due to the industrial exposure. Can you see the exponential, repeat, and sequential application of liberal construction for the benefit of providing benefits for these particular injured workers, these particular peace officers? It's a tremendous benefit to protect this certain class of employees, and here we're talking about police officers. So I want to share with you a particular case that deals with this issue and helps to illustrate many of these principles here in just a moment, and that's the LYCETT versus County of San Mateo case. I'll share that with you in just a moment. And before we do that, let's just talk about some other recent revisions to law recently passed to further protect and provide benefits and apply liberal construction to these certain classes of employees. So this has to do with the recent passage of Senate Bill 1127, which becomes effective for injuries after 1/1/23, meaning that this is now effective. This is a new law that was just recently passed to provide additional liberal construction for these classes of employees. So this brand new law, Senate Bill 1127, amends several of the labor codes that we deal with in our qualified medical evaluations, including Section 5402 and Section 5413 to the labor code. And here's some of the summary of the changes that this bill provides for. Number one, it reduces the time period to accept or reject liability for certain industrial injuries or illnesses sustained by specified members of law enforcement and firefighters from 90 days to 75 days, a reduced determination period, a reduced delay by the claims administrator to decide whether this claim is industrial or non-industrial, thereby providing for sooner decision making and sooner benefits for these particular classes of employees. For cancer injury claims that are defined in Section 3212.1, which we just talked about, it increases the number of compensable weeks of temporary disability from 2 years, 104 weeks, standard 2 years of temporary disability, to more than double, to 240 weeks, okay? More than doubling of the benefits applicable for these classes of employees. Finally, it provides for an increased penalty up to $50,000 if liability for presumptive injuries covered by Labor Code Sections 3212 to 3213.2, the duty belt presumption, is unreasonably rejected. So there's a tremendous disincentive to employers and claims administrators to tinker around and to deny these claims, because the disincentive is the potential for a $50,000 penalty for unreasonably rejecting these claims that are otherwise presumed by law to be industrial injuries when those injuries are unreasonably delayed by the claims administrator. So let's talk about the LYCETT versus San Mateo case, which illustrates many of these principles involved in Labor Code Section 3213.2. Okay, so this is the LYCETT versus City of San Mateo case involving a police officer. So LYCETT was a police officer employed between February 2013 and September 2018. So you can see here, this is a period of time greater than 5 years. So according to Labor Code Section 3213.2, LYCETT already qualifies for criteria A, the length of employment. He has greater than 5 years of employment. Now, LYCETT went on paid administrative leave. 9/30/18 was the last day of work through 9/1/19, after which LYCETT officially retired. Now, with his 5 years of employment, he's allowed 3 calendar months for each year of employment. 5 years times 3 months is 15 months, is 1 year and 3 months. By law, LYCETT has up to 15 months after the last day of employment to report industrial lower back injury, to report the lower back pain condition for the duty belt presumption to apply. Well, there was no medical treatment and no reporting of the injury during the period of employment. So after the period of employment is when LYCETT reported the injury. This is an example of the post-employment cumulative trauma injury claim. The first medical treatment was given on 7/31/19, where the medical provider provided first evidence of disability in the form of work restrictions. So even though Mr. LYCETT was not working, the medical provider provided for work restrictions, provided medical treatment, thus satisfying the 2 criteria for injury here in the state of California. In order to qualify for an injury in the state of California, the condition must cause work disability, and in this case it did produce work disability in the form of work restrictions provided by the medical evaluator, and it must also cause a need for medical treatment. And in this case, both of those criteria were satisfied. LYCETT filed the application for adjudication of claim in July 2019, well within the 15-month timeline provided for him to report this as an industrial injury. Well, more than a year after that, and after Officer LYCETT had gone through medical treatment, the orthopedic agreed medical evaluator provided a permanent and stationary opinion, and the evaluator diagnosed chronic low back strain and provided for 7% whole person impairment under DRE category 2. Okay, and we're all familiar with the lumbar spine DRE category 2. So he provided probably for 5% whole person impairment with maybe a 2% add-on for pain or something like that. And the agreed medical evaluator provided for 10% impairment due to non-industrial factors. So how do you think that the apportionment determination would be handled in this particular case? We just learned under Labor Code Section 4663, Section E, that for these classes of employees, for these types of injuries, there shall be no apportionment for the impairment due to these injuries, or due to these impairments. So let's see how it turned out. Now, this was a case, this LYCETT versus the City of San Mateo was a case that was vigorously denied by the defendant, and the defendant had several different approaches to attempt to disprove the industrial causation for LYCETT's lower back impairment. And this case came to the workers' compensation judge, and the judge confirmed, number one, that LYCETT did indeed wear a duty belt, but the history revealed that LYCETT was not required to wear a duty belt the entire 5 years of his employment. But that became an irrelevant point of the defendant because the law, Labor Code Section 3213.2, does not require, okay, and this is another application of liberal construction, it does not require that the employee wear the duty belt the entirety of the 5 years. It simply requires that the employee be an employee for 5 years, and during the course of that employment, that the employee be required to wear a duty belt during the course of employment. And the judge confirmed that LYCETT wore a duty belt at least for the first 2 years of his employment. After that 2 years, LYCETT transitioned to a duty vest, but that was an irrelevant point because the length of time of use of the duty belt is not cited or stated in Labor Code Section 3212.2. So LYCETT met the requisite requirement that he was required to wear a duty belt during the course of his employment. He last wore the duty belt or vest on 12/30/2017, and remember that he remained in employment for at least another 9 months through September 2018. So one of the points of the defendant was that Mr. LYCETT did not even wear a duty belt for greater than 9 months preceding his last date of employment, but that point became irrelevant as relates to the law as described in Labor Code 3212. So in this case, AOE-COE was established, and the judge ruled that where an applicant meets the requisite length of employment, which is 5 years, under Section 3213.2, but only wears a duty belt for part of the employment. Can you see the application of liberal construction here? The applicant is entitled to the presumption, the presumptive injury, the presumption that the lower back impairment is presumed to be industrial. It's taken as fact that the lower back impairment is industrial. And she quoted, because the injured worker worked in a covered police position for more than the required 5 years, and at least during some portion of that 5 years, was required to wear a duty belt for part of that time. So doctors, I hope this helps you. You know, we see these examinees all the time. And part of this education process of bringing this material to you is to help you to be able to identify and recognize these scenarios when they present to you in your evaluation. You know, as you go through your evaluation, you want to ask yourself and try to identify if any of these important cases, if any of these important rules or laws are operative in your evaluation. For example, if you've read the Benson case and you understand apportionment to multiple dates of injury, you want to ask yourself on your very next evaluation, are you dealing with a Benson evaluation? Is this examinee coming to you with multiple dates of injury? If so, a Benson analysis will be required. Are you dealing with a kite analysis, for example? Are you dealing with a scenario where there's multiple impairments that may more appropriately be added versus combined? Are you dealing with a Hikita case where there's apportionment to medical treatment? In other words, the point of reviewing these cases is to help you to be able to identify and recognize these scenarios when they're operative in your evaluation. If you can spot and identify these scenarios, then you can appropriately conduct the evaluation, you can appropriately conclude the evaluation accurately, consistent with law and consistent with state case law, as described in some of these precedential type cases. For example, consistent with the LYCETT versus County of San Mateo or City of San Mateo case. So if you can identify these scenarios in your police officers, the next time you evaluate a police officer who's presenting to you with a lower back injury complaint, you know that you're dealing with a duty belt presumption, and therefore your opinion on AOA COE is automatic. It's already defined by law. If you're evaluating this police officer and the police officer is permanently stationary for which you have a lumbar spine impairment, you know that your approximate percentages just became 100% industrial and 0% non-industrial because it's required by law. So doctors, I hope this helps you as you go through your career and as you evaluate these important employees that provide us such great service here in the state of California. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion. I want to thank you for your commitment to excellence. I want to thank you for your dedication in quickly and accurately resolving disputed issues in California workers' compensation. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.